Do you want to be part of something bigger? At Siemens, we use AI to transform the everyday. Our engineering solutions drive innovation and change. We're leading in technology and building a sustainable future. Join Siemens and make an impact to transform the everyday. Apply now and be part of something extraordinary. Visit siemens.co.in/careers.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. On May 9, 1874, a boy named Howard was born in Kensington, an upscale neighborhood in the sprawling metropolis of London, England. Howard was the last of 11 children, and his parents, Samuel, an artist and commercial illustrator, and Martha, were beginning to regret their move to London from their hometown of Norfolk, more than 100 miles to the north. The reason for this regret was that, tragically, 3 of Howard's older siblings, all under the age of 8, had died since the family made the move to London. Although reasonably well off, moving the entire family back to Norfolk simply wasn't in the cards, so they, instead, opted to send young Howard back north to protect his health. He had already begun to show signs of frailty and sickliness. Before leaving London, Howard's father had noticed the artistic potential of his youngest child and fostered that talent from the very beginning, and when making arrangements for his son in Norfolk, he made sure that his artistic education would continue. Although a more formal education was lacking for Howard, his training in the arts flourished with the assistance of a local heiress named Lady Amherst, who also recognized the boy's talent and spared no expense in cultivating that talent. Of particular interest to young Howard was the Amhersts' personal collection of Egyptian antiquities on display in their mansion. Howard would spend hours every day exploring the collection, making sketches, asking questions. His curiosity grew with the Amherst collection until finally, in 1891, when he was 17 years old, the Amherst family made arrangements for Howard to travel to Egypt and assist in a project funded by the Amherst Foundation that concerned the excavation and recording of Middle Kingdom tombs at Beni Hassan. Howard would be responsible for overseeing the copying process of tomb decorations, ancient paintings that had been entombed more than 4,000 years ago. But Howard wasn't just content to oversee, and he made significant innovations to the methods that had been used for decades preceding his arrival. Remember, he was only 17, but he made his presence known right off the bat. As a result, he was invited to stay in Egypt and went from dig site to dig site, working alongside the luminaries of the age, especially Sir Flinders Petrie, known as the father of Egyptian archaeology. Petrie was the first to develop dating methods using pottery fragments, as well as being the first and most vocal proponent for careful, systematic cataloging and preservation of artifacts. And Petrie was also a hardcore racist with some really awful ideas about white supremacy. So, he had his issues. But he also pioneered the study of ancient Egypt. After a year with Petrie, Howard would continue to work with and learn from the early trailblazers in Egyptology. But no one could have guessed that this boy, Howard Carter was his full name, would soon outshine them all by making the single greatest archaeological discovery in history: the tomb of King Tutankhamun. But at what cost? Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Pharaoh's Curse. It would be more than 30 years from the day Howard first set foot on Egyptian soil, but he seemed destined to make history. There were early signs that he understood on an almost spiritual level how the ancients thought, how they lived, and most importantly, how they worshipped. Although immensely talented as an archaeologist, Carter would ascend to, and then lose, the prestigious position of Chief Inspector of Antiquities for Lower Egypt, a post that included the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. He lost the job because he encouraged and backed up local Egyptian security guards and had them forcefully defend themselves against a group of drunken French tourists trying to force their way onto a protected site. This came as a blow to Carter, as he was officially out of the service of the government, and he was forced to move to Luxor in southern Egypt and try to make his living as an artist, selling his watercolor paintings that mimicked the decorations on the walls of the tombs he so loved exploring. Given his new lower status, Carter could only watch as important discoveries were made by his rivals in the only site that ever truly inspired him, the famed Valley of the Kings. It was Carter's dream to oversee an excavation there, but the rights to dig in that area were difficult to come by. Carter had studied the entire valley. He saw where others had dug, both successfully and unsuccessfully, and was convinced that there were many areas that hadn't been properly explored, including, most importantly, a large swath of land on the valley floor that was under a thick layer of flood debris and other workmen's debris. The walls of this secluded ravine in the Valley of the Kings, which wasn't far from Luxor actually, just right across the Nile, had been extensively searched and had yielded dozens of tombs carved out of the limestone. Many of them looted centuries earlier, but were still considered significant finds in terms of naming and dating the history of the great dynastic kings. But Carter knew that waiting there in the immortal sands of that desert lay hidden a tomb of an obscure boy king that was just waiting to be discovered. Carter's suspicions were heightened when American archaeologist Theodore Davis made a string of monumental discoveries. First, a mysterious tomb known only as KV-55, which contained a bounty of treasure alongside an unnamed mummy many believed to be the pharaoh Akhenaten. The reason this excited Carter was that the boy King Tut ruled shortly after Akhenaten and was known for restoring a more traditional order that had been largely eschewed by his predecessor. And the evidence for the existence of an undiscovered tomb was starting to pile up. Davis, though not exactly adept at cataloging his finds, managed to accurately list a number of artifacts that bore the name Tutankhamun, including, most significantly, a royal seal associated with King Tut at the entrance to KV-55. Carter surmised that if the presence of King Tut's seal at the entrance to Akhenaten's tomb meant that it was sealed during the reign of Tut. If so, then it was highly likely that Tut would have chosen a site for his own tomb nearby. And that hunch would prove to be correct. But how would he ever get the rights to dig there? Time and circumstance, along with the cultivation of a solid relationship with a wealthy English aristocrat, this all conspired to deliver a once-in-a-lifetime chance to the now 40-year-old Howard Carter. It was 1914, and the American Theodore Davis, who had held the digging rights to the Valley of the Kings for decades, was near death. And as luck would have it, he was also convinced, along with the rest of the archaeological community, that the famed Valley of the Kings had been exhausted and would yield no further treasures. But Carter felt differently and convinced his wealthy patron, the Earl of Carnarvon, to buy up those rights. Carter would finally have his chance. Nothing would stop him now. Hell, it would take a land war in Europe to keep him from digging. Oh, what? Oh, World War I actually caused all excavations in Egypt to be put on hold? Okay. And that's true. It did. World War I broke out and everything stopped. Carnarvon actually turned his estate in England into a military hospital, and Howard Carter took a government job in the Middle East. But as the war was winding down, slowly but surely, activity began to resume in the Valley of the Kings, and Carter would finally get his shot at glory. But where would he dig? So I'm a fan of the show Gold Rush, It's actually the only show I watch regularly. There was an episode years ago where the gold had run out and the team was short of their goal and they needed to get creative. The area where their claim was located had been popular with gold miners for more than 100 years, and every generation of miners used the same road to get in and out of the ancient river valley that held hundreds of individual claims. This road bisected the claim that the episode was about, and the miners, suddenly realizing that they had several acres of virgin ground under the road, decided to dig it up. No one had done it before because it would mean a ton of work to build an alternate road to maintain access to the valley, which was vital, and the sheer amount of material to be moved in order to get to the gold would take weeks. But it proved more than worth it. The gold deposits discovered beneath that road that lay undisturbed for millions of years, that no one could be bothered with digging up, proved to be among the richest gold strikes in recent memory. So when Howard Carter finally had his say regarding where to excavate in the Valley of the Kings, he chose an area that was the most likely to be undisturbed. Basically, it was the trash pit. For decades, whenever anyone was excavating one of the tombs along the walls of the valley, all the worthless rock and debris would be dumped in an area near the center of the valley floor. All this debris eventually began to form the shape of a triangle, and when work began in late 1917, this debris-strewn triangle would be Howard Carter's main focus. Excavation by hand, with pickaxe and shovel, commenced, day after day, loading rock and dirt into trucks that were then hauled away by rail. Carter knew they needed to get down to bedrock, for that was where the tombs of the kings were carved, into the very earth itself. At the end of the very first digging season in early 1918, Carter made an important discovery: the remains of a group of huts that housed ancient workers. Artifacts proved that these huts were in use during the 19th dynasty, just after the time of King Tut, and importantly, they appeared to be undisturbed. Also of note, these huts were right in front of the tomb of Ramses VI, a popular tourist attraction, and only about 15 yards from the tomb of Akhenaten. Carter guessed that if King Tut's tomb lay undisturbed, it would be very close to where he was standing, and most likely underneath the remains of those huts. And why wouldn't he trust his instincts? His willingness to excavate decades of other people's rubble had already proven fruitful. Why not excavate beneath those huts? The reason I ask is because he didn't for another 4 freaking years. Now, there are a few possible explanations for this incredibly odd behavior. I mean, he should have dug immediately. But one possible reason for his reluctance is that an operation of that size would have seriously restricted tourist access to the Ramses tomb. And Carter was, after all, a man dedicated to scientific discovery and sharing those discoveries with the world. Okay, folksy and prudish, but okay. The other, and I feel more likely reason, is that he had a good feeling about what might exist under these huts, and he wanted to save the news for a time when Carnarvon was thinking about pulling his funding. A shrewd political move, to be sure, and one that, once again, proved prescient. In late 1921, Carnarvon told Carter that the gravy train was over. No more digging. This is when Carter played his ace in the hole and described the huts, the undisturbed nature of the ground beneath them, their proximity to both Ramses and Akhenaten, and, as a coup de grace, the news that among the contents of Akhenaten's tomb were large jars that bore the name of Tutankhamun. And what was in those jars? Oh, not much. Just the leftover material from the boy king's embalming. Because no item that ever touched the flesh of the king was ever discarded. They saved everything. Tut was close. Carter just needed one more season. Carnarvon went for it, and that one last season began in October of 1922. Very soon after, the remains of the very first hut was cleared away, and on November 4th, 1922, Carter arrived at the worksite to incredible news. No sooner had the workers hit bedrock than a step was discovered. Additional digging revealed a staircase carved out of the rock that led 12 feet below the entrance to Ramsey's tomb. Carter knew this was it, but he needed to contain his excitement. By the end of the day, workers had exposed the upper part of a door. Further excavation revealed the official seal of the royal necropolis. A king was buried here, but which one? The big test would come next. What was on the other side of that door? Theoretically, there should be all manner of debris, stones and rubble, the mess left behind after the last humans to walk there, priests, had exited and sealed the door for eternity. If thieves had looted the place, the hallway would be cleared of any debris to make it easier to remove the large items that were sure to have been left for the king's journey to immortality. Carter broke through the upper corner of the door and dared to shine a flashlight in. As he had hoped, he saw building stones and bits of dried plaster strewn about the floor. It was now virtually guaranteed that he had discovered a completely undisturbed tomb. And now came the excruciating part. To go any further and not be completely ostracized from the community, Carter knew that Carnarvon needed to be there. He immediately sent word to London as his crew went to work reburying the tomb to hide it to prevent looters from finding it. His message to Carnarvon was brief and ecstatic. Quote, "At last have made a wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Congratulations." But then he had to wait more than 2 weeks for Carnarvon to arrive. Can you imagine? Your life's work is waiting just beneath your feet, a discovery that was sure to change history, and you have to chill for 2 weeks before you can even go in. Carter spent that time hiring experts to assist in uncovering the rest of the tomb and additional security. So Carnarvon arrives on November 22nd, and by the 24th, the workers had again reached the doorway to the chamber, but this time, they continued the excavation until the entire door was revealed. Quick aside, in Egyptian archaeology, a cartouche is a carving or painting of an oblong border that contains specific hieroglyphics that name a monarch. It's kind of like the official seal of the office of the president, only personalized for a specific ruler. Tutankhamun's cartouche contained a simple disc rendering of the sun at the top, a scarab beetle in the middle, and a stylized basket at the bottom. As the excavation of this door proceeded, Carter knew they would soon be seeing the cartouche that would announce what king was buried within. And before long, the sun beetle basket design was clearly visible, and they knew, for the first time, without a doubt, that the lost tomb of King Tutankhamun had been found. It took a further 2 days to clear the steep 30-foot passageway that led to another door. This one with the door handle sealed with an intricate knot tied with a length of rope that looks like something you'd get at Home Depot. You should really check out the photos online. This knot, it's incredible to see, was tied by a departing priest and was completely untouched for more than 3,000 years, until this day, November 26th, 1922. Again, as a precaution, Howard broke through the top corner of the door and allowed the ancient air to escape the sealed chamber. Then he lit a candle and attached it to a pole and fed the flame into the tomb to make sure it didn't ignite everything inside due to a buildup of poisonous gas. The flame of the candle calmly flickered in the darkness, and Carter knew that it was safe to enter. But before he did, he grabbed his flashlight and ladder, and after what seemed like a lifetime, because it nearly was, Howard Carter peered into the tomb of King Tut. It was the first time in 3 millennia that the chamber would be accepting visitors. Carter would remark that at first he thought he was looking at decorations painted or carved under the walls of the tomb. But as his eyesight adjusted to the amber glow of his flashlight, the 3-dimensionality of the objects began to register in his brain, and he realized that he was looking at the king's belongings that would help him in his journey to the next life. Carter was amazed at what he saw. Carnarvon and the others could wait no longer, and he broke the breathless silence. "Can you see anything?" he asked. And Carter responded with perhaps the most famous 3 words in the history of archaeology. "Yes, wonderful things." So real quick, before we hear from Carter himself as to the contents of the tomb, let's go over what all this stuff was for. So according to Egyptian ideas about the afterlife as it relates to pharaohs, simply put, the Egyptians worshipped the sun, and the representative of the sun on earth were the pharaohs. When a pharaoh died, his death was likened to the setting sun, and the spirit of the king would follow the path that the sun takes through the underworld. Along the way, the king has to go through a bunch of trials. For example, he has to fight a massive serpent. Another one, he needs to have his heart weighed against the feather of truth, which is a really cool representation of the requirement of justice in the hearts of the Egyptian leaders. Until the pharaoh, again following the assumed path of the sun, would rise the next day as the sun god himself and take his place in the sky alongside the great rulers that went before him. So after death, it's an actual battle that the king is preparing for, hence the need for all this stuff. Here's one of the only recorded interviews with Howard Carter describing the tomb.
I suppose most excavators would confess to a feeling of awe, almost embarrassment, when they break into a tomb closed and sealed by pious hands so many centuries ago. 33 centuries had passed since human feet last trod the floor on which we stood, and yet the signs of recent life were around us. A half-filled bowl of mortar, a blackened lamp, the chips of wood left on the floor by a careless carpenter. We had penetrated 2 chambers, but when we came to a golden shrine with doors closed and sealed, we realized that we were in the presence of the dead king. We were to witness a spectacle such as no other man in our times had been privileged to see. I carefully cut the cord, removed the precious seal, drew back the bolts, and opened the doors, when a second shrine was revealed, even more brilliant in workmanship than the last. With intense excitement, I went forward and unbolted the inner doors. They slowly swung open, and there, filling the entire area within, stood an immense yellow quartzite sarcophagus. It effectually barred any further progress until we could raise the lid. Then a decisive moment. None of us but felt the solemnity of the occasion. In a dead silence, the huge lid, weighing over 1.25 tons, was raised from its bed. Light shone into the sarcophagus, but how disappointing. The contents were completely covered by linen shrouds. But as the last shroud was rolled back, a gasp of wonderment escaped our lips. So gorgeous was the sight that met our eyes. A golden effigy of the young king of magnificent workmanship filled the whole of the interior. This was but the lid of a series of 3 coffins, nested one within the other, enclosing the mortal remains of the young King Tutankhamun. Laid on that golden outer lid was a tiny wreath of flowers, as it pleased us to think, the last farewell offering of the widowed girl queen to her husband. Among all that regal splendor, everywhere the glint of gold, there was nothing so beautiful as those few withered flowers. They told us what a short period 3,300 years really was. But yesterday and the morrow.
And bear in mind how this room actually looked. When I first started studying Egyptology, my mind pictured a beautifully appointed room, decorated in the ancient style, similar to how the houses in Pompeii were discovered centuries after being encased in volcanic ash, frozen in time. Or like how future beings might experience a perfectly preserved IKEA, with all the rooms set up perfectly right down to the books on the shelves. That's not what this was. What Carter discovered, at least in this first chamber, was more akin to a public storage unit. Shit stacked on top of other shit, some items stashed in a corner. The chariot wouldn't fit through the door, so they took it apart and left it that way. Yes, tons of the stuff was either made of gold or covered in gold, but it was a storage space. Nothing refined about it. Now, the burial chamber was a different story. Although small, it was the gift that kept on giving for Carter. The massive sarcophagus held no fewer than 4 nested coffins, each one more elaborate and exceptional than the last, until they reached what has become the most recognizable death mask in the history of mankind, the Mona Lisa of the macabre, the solid gold funerary mask of King Tut. Months later, when Carter was able to actually examine the mask in a laboratory setting, he was astonished at the craftsmanship of the mask, remarking that sometimes he would forget that he was with a 3,300-year-old mummy because it seemed like he was with a real person who just happened to be made out of gold. So lifelike were the features. It wouldn't be long before the discovery was the most popular story in the world, and the Egyptian archaeological gold rush was on. But what about that curse? No, I haven't forgotten. I was just having too much fun writing about Carter and the discovery of the tomb. So, I guess all that spooky stuff will have to wait until the next episode. But trust me, it'll be worth it. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.